Welcome to Trust No One, the X-Files podcast, where some of my fellow agents and I discuss episodes of the X-Files. Today we'll be discussing the second episode of the X-Files. It's called Deep Throat and first aired on 17th September 1993. To the panel, what are your favourite parts of this episode? I'll ask Agent Brad, since you're a newcomer to the show first.
Hey, folks. I like the star viewing nighttime scene where they drove out into the countryside and they were by that fence, and they were kind of, Mulder was kind of observing the night sky, and specifically when Scully was sleeping in the car and Mulder came down like an excited little boy and you got to come and see this, and it was this kind of a nice intimate moment between the two characters of joy and excitement that was very innocent and very childlike. So that's why I liked it.
I think probably one of my favorite bits is when they've had that encounter, and then the stoner kids, Emil and Zoe, come sort of running out, and they all have to kind of run away from these lights together. And there's this lovely bit where they're sort of crouched behind a bush and these lights are shining down. And all four of them in their different ways just look completely like, yes, we've done it. We've achieved something together, which is rather beautiful. And then the scene in the cafe after that where they're talking it through. Just, I don't know, it's the excitement, isn't it, of the three of them versus Scully's skepticism that's in such stark relief there. So those are probably my two favourite bits.
Mine is when Mrs. Budahas insists to Mulder and Scully that her husband has been tampered with. It's a really dramatic and heartbreaking scene, I think. And any viewers who lost someone to Alzheimer's or mental illness can probably appreciate that scene. Like, that is not my loved one. And even though in this case he actually totally was tampered with and the conspiracies are real, but just the emotional truthfulness of that scene, I think, was very impactful for probably many viewers. And if I may, my least favorite scene was when the teenagers were eating. It was loud and sloppy and gross. Close your mouths when you chew, young people. Being stoned is no excuse. Come on.
I think my favorite scene, I'm going to have to agree with Agent Bennett. Really just for the same reasons. The part where they're in the diner, I like that they're interjecting little bits of what I felt was humor. Like when Emil has the hamburger and he's like making the sound of the UFO come down. It's just like, all right, that's a pretty realistic thing that I think a teenager would do. And it's kind of clever. And I think that you're 2 episodes in, so you're starting to see little snippets of humor, kind of seeing where they can fit that in. And, it's a stark contrast from just seriousness, and I think that's why I liked that scene in particular.
Cool. I sort of noticed that just before this live session that sort of nighttime diner scene is a sort of very exact scene that starts with Scully asking the teens, "So what exactly were you doing in there?" and ends with the boys saying, "No, they look exactly like that." I thought that was like cool bookend to that scene. I'd never noticed that before. And also, I really like the final line when Deep Throat tells Mulder they've been here for a long, long time.
Oh, yeah, that's so good.
What differences, if any, did you notice in how Mulder and Scully were portrayed between episodes 1 and 2?
Well, this is a year after the pilot was filmed, right? So there was a big old gap between so obviously just physically they've changed, haven't they? They look older and they look slicker, and Mulder's had a haircut, which is obviously quite exciting. And he just looks a little bit kind of more together. But Scully, I think as well, her look had changed slightly. I mean, we discussed last week, didn't we, about how she was very much, based on kind of the investigator from Hannibal and Silence of the Lambs, and so now she seemed to be a little bit more I don't know, of a rounded character, of a believable person,
Yeah.
as opposed to a caricature, I would say. And apparently she had quite a big influence even in the way that she was styled and her outfit choices and her hair choices. By the time the series was kind of commissioned, it was like, okay, so what do we want this character to look like? So I think her influence is coming through there. She's certainly a bit more stylish, if still quite boxy, I would say. So stylistically, I think there's a big change.
I saw her hair was much shorter than it was in the pilot episode. And I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. I say, well, it's not either. It's just a thing. What I really noticed was she seemed to be much, when I say she, I mean Gillian Anderson, seemed to be much more aware of who that character was and wanted to play her strong. And she was much more assertive. And there were specific things that I wrote down where she, what do you honestly hope to see here? Basically calling him out. And I felt like that was a complete 180. If you think back to the first episode where they met one another, where she's extending her hand, I felt like she was very feminine and gentle and, almost like she was speaking to a child. I'm looking forward to working with you. I've heard a lot about you. And now, she's, talking about the Aurora Project and let's get out of here as fast as we can. And, really holding her own. I felt like it was a very, very different character. And it just seemed like, she knew who she wanted Scully to be, and they let her take that and run with it.
I agree.
I thought they both seemed like camera in general. Like I was having like flashbacks to the scene outside the mental hospital or psychiatric hospital in the first episode where she like confronts Mulder, and I thought like, I don't think she goes to quite the same sort of dynamic in this episode. That's the thought I had. So I thought it was quite interesting you say like she was more assertive with him here.
I think also more playful on her end too. When they were in the diner by themselves, speaking to the server, and she's going on and on about having taken the trash out and taken the photo of that UFO, and Scully leans over and goes, "Sucker," like that, and then that kind of came back in another scene, and it was just kind of like, oh, hey, there's that banter that's starting, and it didn't seem forced. It didn't seem like something that was out of place. It seemed natural. And I think that was probably one of the things that started to really make you realize that these two definitely click. They know who they want these characters to be. And that's something that's likely going to be seen again and again.
I really enjoyed how in this episode, there's a story arc for her within one episode where she goes kind of from being this, she seems to be at heart a rule follower. She's saying to Mulder in one scene, well, a government has a right to keep information confidential. And then when Mulder's kidnapped, she completely goes rogue and like holds up a government agent and like goes berserk and breaks a million rules. And so that's within one episode, you see the richness of her character and the depth of her character. And then that coupled with the sense of humor is just awesome.
Yeah, I agree. I think that everything that you guys have already said, I think the purpose behind the change was to age appropriate and professionalize the characters. In the first episode, the pilot, I felt that both of them seemed young, and both of them seemed like teens. It was
Green.
Almost it was like they were flirting. Like she almost like she was flirting with him, and he was being the goofy popular kid in high school, and the whole dynamic of them being FBI agents seemed to take a back seat. It was situationally appropriate, but the dynamic between them wasn't. And given that, I think one of the purposes behind the Scully character was to establish and create a strong kind of almost like a feminist presence, someone who had a more assertive relationship and role in a partnership between a man and a woman, right? That buddy relationship. She had to change because it just wasn't clicking in that first episode. So I think they anchored her a bit more. They created a stronger character, or maybe Gillian Anderson herself took on that kind of quality because she wanted to portray it differently. And even Mulder with his haircut, that was to age him up a little bit, make him look, appropriate for his age group and kind of strong, as well as, just being kind of a contrarian. And their dynamic, that interaction between them and that diner was really good to establish that buddy kind of relationship where they knew they were playing opposites each other. Mulder was his his believer, and Scully was the skeptic or the rule follower, and they had to have some kind of bridge between those two things. And I liked the second episode because it anchored them better in those roles than the first pilot, the first episode was. And I think that was an intentional choice on the part of the production team. I think they looked at it and they said, well, these characters are not going to click for a season. They're not going to flow well. So we need to change up a little bit more and give them a better grounding.
That makes a lot of sense, because thematically too, the episode Deep Throat was way more sophisticated than the first episode, which was like teenagers and aliens, and this was a lot more adult. It's about the government, and then the shadow government, and the hidden machinations that people suspect exist behind the official government, and top secret projects and all that thrilling stuff. But it's very different from, you're right, they did come off as a little bit young, and like as if they didn't, like they were kind of ill-fitting in their grown-up jobs.
Yeah.
I have to wonder, after they filmed the pilot, if they took a look at the footage and thought, okay, we have something here, but this is what we might need to take a look at. This is what we need to change. So perhaps when they got the go-ahead to continue filming subsequent episodes, they realized what worked, what didn't work. I know many times when they show pilot episodes, they get feedback from their audiences. And I did read one of the things that they had to do specifically. Gillian Anderson and David Duchovny had to take a firearms course to learn how to actually properly hold firearms, so that it actually looked real. So I think once they realized that this was a go, making it look like these characters were a little more mature than what they had started with in the pilot episode, making them appear to be more professional and FBI-esque, and just making it more believable. Because I think when you have people emulating something that's in the real world, if it's not believable, you're going to lose a large portion of people with that hook.
Well, one of the things I noticed in Gillian Anderson's performance between the two episodes was her vocal register dropped down a little bit in the second episode. The first one, it was very, very, higher pitched, and it that takes on a different quality. That vocal quality presents her character differently, and even how she has to deliver the lines. So there was a really a number of subtle changes that helped communicate, but also I think helped to establish the character for the run of the series as a strong female character that people can aspire toward, having the same kind of qualities. It was a strong second wave feminism character for portrayal on TV. At least my assertion or my opinion about that. The character wasn't trying to do anything except be accepted and be valued equally as her peers in the FBI, and to contribute and be held accountable the same way as her peers, as her male peers, right? To receive the same benefits, but also the same accountability. And it was a good dynamic for the showrunners to create that character arc for her, because it was easily accessible for young women who wanted to have that same kind of relationship and dynamic in the early 90s. And and even into the 2000s.
I think it's well
Regarding-
to go on, Dan.
Oh, sorry. Regarding like Scully, I read like, do you know there's a scene like near the end of the episode where she's like writing up a report? I heard that was like insisted on basically by the studio. I don't think like Chris Curtis was like against it and didn't want like such a pat ending, is what I read.
They
Uh,
said when the network had taken a look at the episode when it was done, they did not feel like there was enough of a conclusion. So they went back and then they did that narration with her. And, you know, unbeknownst to them, that was going to become kind of a keystone in the future for many, many episodes. But I think, you know, like Agent Brad was saying, you have this character that I think a very big draw for her. And a lot of the people that really took to her, it was you had somebody strong, the inflection with the voice. I think they realized, they being the network, that they really had something here, especially when they were seeing how people were reacting to this female agent. And just figuring out what to do with that. I still think in that time, having a female in something that's, in my opinion, a male-dominated career field was probably a risk for them. But I think that, you know, was a risk that definitely paid off. And I mean, as we know, the Scully effect and just how it has had such an impact on women. I don't think they ever meant to do that. But, you know, even if it was just a happy accident, it was something that definitely, I think, was a great choice, whoever's decision that was. And it's something that carried on throughout the entire series.
Do you think I haven't done the research? I haven't done the research on this. Do you think that this was one of the first times a strong female character was portrayed in a drama in that era? I know the 80s had comedies, and there was a lot of you know, buddy shows and a lot of, you know, Friends and things like that, where there were strong female characters, but they're always part of an ensemble.
Right.
And they
can't
weren't
remember
in
which
dramatic.
I can't remember which came first, but I believe Buffy the Vampire Slayer was pretty much alongside this.
Yeah,
But obviously Buffy, you know, has these, you know, supernatural abilities and all that sort of thing. But actually, in terms of female representation, that was a fantastic show, because not only did you have strong female leads who literally kicked ass, but you also had this introduction of like, it wasn't all hetero relationships. It wasn't all like, ultimately there was a patriarchal force behind them supporting them. You know, it undid a lot of those things that had been essential really for female heroes to succeed in the 80s. So I'd say that was groundbreaking. I would say this was groundbreaking. But I guess what you had was Buffy having to use violence effectively as a way of fighting her way to the top, whereas Scully uses intelligence, intellect, and her battles are verbal. Even though she'll pull a gun.
In this very episode, she held an agent at gunpoint.
Exactly.
He broke the window of the car, and she was ready. Like, she was physically, you know, in the X-Files, I really love that even though she's tiny in real life, apparently they put her on those, I've forgotten what they're called.
An Apple box.
Oh yeah, they called it a Scully platform in that one apparently.
But she was quite physical in the series.
Yeah.
Certainly not as much as Buffy, but she you know, she had to hold her own physically against all sorts of attackers. So
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think
found that
probably
inspiring.
exactly. I think that's one of the reasons Buffy was a fantasy. Buffy was, you know, horror and comedy and teen, right? It was geared toward a different audience. But this was a more, as we've already discussed, the tweaking from episode 1 to episode 2 became a little more sophisticated, and they angled it toward a different audience, I think, or at least they angled it to be picked up and appreciated by a little bit older audience than, say, Buffy was, right? Or maybe it was the Buffy audience that they were trying to, you know, hook into it. But yeah, I think the Buffy was a good show, and the stories, even though they were fantasy and fantastical and all that, the characters were real, and the situations the characters were experiencing were real. And if we shift that now toward, as we said, X-Files was accessible sci-fi or accessible, topic of aliens, right? Through this kind of very real situation kind of thing for these two characters, and having her portray strength, and not just strength as in I'm going to go and kick some bad guys, but strength in knowing how far she can take it and why she wants to take it that far, and in protection of her partner, her male partner, right? And situationally, it would be very acceptable for a male partner to be acting that way to protect his male partner, or for a man to be acting that way to protect his female partner. But to flip that role and have her in that position was fantastic choices, and it gave the show a balancing between those two characters, right? It became Scully going through her arcs and Mulder going through his arcs, and sometimes they gelled and came together, and equally balanced characters for the audience to kind of enjoy. I thought it was a really good series in general for those relationships, and then the things that they went into in the later episodes, but also later seasons, helped keep the audience engaged with those characters and those character development.
I think with Scully in particular, Chris Carter really fought to have Gillian Anderson cast as that character because she didn't fit the mold of what was already on TV. Right. I have to wonder how much of this was planned, that he didn't want that character to be the standard female blonde girly sidekick. And if, this was all part of the plan, and again, it could have been a huge risk that he was taking, saying, hey, this is going to be a kick-ass female lead. I need you to be assertive. I need you to bring it. You're going to steal this car, take this guy's gun. You're going to outwit them with smarts, all of that. That I feel like that was relatively new for the era. I don't know if Chris Carter really understood the weight that was going to hold. It snowballed, and I think that was a huge facet that really made this show, I think, relatable for the female audiences. You have that really strong lead. She's, first of all, incredibly intelligent. She's beautiful, and she is doing the same job as a man. And, that's not how a lot of female characters were portrayed during that time. I don't think there were a lot of those types of roles out there during that. And I think that in that respect, if Chris Carter had planned for that all along, props to him. That was a great move. Or if Gillian Anderson just said, you know what, I'm not playing this, girly sidekick. Like, I want them to see what women are capable of. Regardless of where that came from, it was a great move, and it definitely shaped where this series went, in my opinion.
I wonder what would have happened to Mulder if Scully had not rescued him in this episode. Would they have released him as quickly, or would they have held on to him and maybe been more punitive? I mean, it was kind of a hostage exchange in a sense, right? She's like, I've got your guy, give me my guy. She had the gun. All right, take him. But what if she had never saved Mulder? What if he was just kind of stuck there, getting injected with who knows what?
Yeah, short-lived series, I can tell you that. I don't think there would have been much further to go from that, right? Because they could have easily wiped out all of his interest, and where does the story, where's the narrative take him after that?
Well, it's sort of connected to the similar question. Like, what do you actually think happened to Robert Budahas and to Mulder?
I think it was some kind of biochemical agent that was introduced. There was some articles, like modern science articles in the 80s, 90s, about the ability to alter or to de-etch the memory engrams or something from memory on the synapses and basically break those connections so that you forget certain things. And it's a short term, like a short term memory or longer term memory. There was stuff in the 80s and 90s about research that was going into that, maybe even connected to Alzheimer's. So it's probably one of those kinds of things, just a memory wipe, which is basically just a chemical wash of the brain to get rid of recent chemical deposits in the brain cells. I think that maybe was what happened.
I feel like the way they set up this episode, I feel like it was implied that this was military, and ultimately what they were doing was erasing memories, whether that was through like drugs, injections, things like that, or other types of testing, electrodes, that kind of stuff. I don't know specifically, but I kind of feel like that's what they set it up as, especially at the end of the pilot, with them putting that stuff in the Pentagon, which, as we had discussed earlier, had that military tie. In this case, you're looking at like military police, and maybe that's all a ruse, to cover up something even bigger. But that's kind of how I felt they set it up. And, whether that's to kind of fool you into thinking one thing or to just set up that mythology arc, that kind of remains to be seen. But I think that's where that kind of came from.
Kind of like helping us understand that we're talking aliens, and aliens, while we assume that to be technological advancement or technological physical technology, that biochemical and other types of technology, other types of developments are going on concurrently. So there's layering of kind of mystery. Maybe that plants that seed as well.
I think because almost the pilot plus this first episode, it's like the UFO greatest hits, isn't it, really? Because you've got the abductees in the beginning, right, who are teenagers who no one ever believes, right? Especially if you're then locked up in what is effectively an asylum. It's like the kids are crazy. Don't listen to the kids. They're all bonkers. It'll all be fine.
They're not crazy. They're high.
They're high. And exactly. And again, in this episode, you get the high teenagers, right? Who like, whoa, man, it was a hamburger. It's like, yeah, all that sort of thing. But then you've got the abductees who turn out to be authentic, whose stories are real, who are then disappeared. Then you get the UFO crash evidence, which obviously links into, like Roswell and everything before that. And you've got the retrieval of that technology and its use in military forces. So if you can take UFO technology, the link is basically that, abductees don't remember. They have their memories wiped, and then those memories come back in flashbacks, like PTSD trauma, effectively. So, if the government, if the military technology is being salvaged in terms of the UFO technology, obviously you would salvage all the other technology as well, wouldn't you? Especially if you had, bodies left behind, which allegedly there were in Roswell. So I think, that this whole idea of, how are they wiping the memories? It's like, well, if we're accepting that they've salvaged UFO technology, that's not even a question, is it? Because if they've already got that kind of scope, they've got the scope to do everything. And I think there's a really lovely bit in this episode where, they talk about the scale of what's being revealed here. So, well, it's a government conspiracy to hide UFO technology. It's like, no, it's not. It's proof of the existence of extraterrestrial life. And if you've got that, then that blows everything open, right? So, that it's one of those ones that for me, it's so nice that it sits together with the pilot, and they didn't try and interject like a different sort of story thread or monster story or anything at this point. It's like, no, do you know what? We'll start with the micro, then we'll show you this, then we'll show you this, and then we'll blow it right open and say, but we've now got to question, the existence of interplanetary connection and communication, and that's massive. And that, for me, what makes this a more mature episode, because there is still pitch towards a teenage audience. I think definitely the comedy's there, the teenage characters are there, but you've also now got this sense of, but if you really know your paranormal and if you're really into this world, you're going to find so much, because we're going to open it all up and we're going to explore every single element.
It's almost like the framing of the series in episode 1 was this, but then the framing after episode 2 was this, right? And because you have to have such an expansive, epic kind of landscape to be able to sustain a series over a number of episodes or number of seasons. So I would agree. I think they framed where they were going with it much better in the second episode, or they needed those two perhaps to be able to frame it correctly.
And regarding like how sort of growing up the storyline was, it sort of hit me like the first dialogue in the episode. that was sort of along those lines was when they find Robert Budahas like in a corner or whatever, and to me he looks like he's been radiated, but I didn't know if that was what everyone thought. But and then it said like, what the hell? And I thought like, not everyone, not all, all parents would want their kids if they were watching it to hear that, maybe. And sorry, the thought that occurred to me regarding causality of what looks like radiation and the memory loss, which is clearly established as memory loss, was I thought it was maybe like some kind of exposure, maybe to like the UFOs or alien craft. But then I was thinking that earlier, but then today I was thinking, like during this discussion actually, I was thinking the crafts that you do see and which Mulder sees are clearly behind the sort of curtains, so it's clearly like, like, surely not that exposed for the people who are being sort of operated on or whatever's happening there.
I think that's so that, for the audience to kind of look and see from Mulder's perspective, it's like just enough to get the idea of what it is, but enough for you to kind of leave that up to your imagination.
Yeah. So,
Absolutely.
Do you prefer this episode or the pilot in general, and why?
I prefer the depth of this one, and as somebody that was massively into the supernatural paranormal from a really young age, like I'd read all the books on Roswell, I've read all the books on like the emergence of triangular UFOs in the 1950s, that the research that I'd kind of the books that I'd read, there were 17,000 case files featuring triangular UFOs, right? By the time that the series was aired. So for me, in terms of the UFO lore and all of these references, it felt far more engaging. And I guess what I really liked in terms of the way it developed was this idea of government conspiracy, because, there's that lovely bit of dialogue. Does the government have the right and the responsibility to protect its secrets? And the answer is, well, when does the human cost become too high? And it's like, well, the human cost, ultimately Sculder, that was a good one. Mulder's representing the humanity, saying, but it doesn't matter about government systems. We should know the truth, and that's really important, and that's why Mulder and Deep Throat, in a way, are the same person, aren't they? They're just, one's got a higher level of access than the other. What is your interest? It's the truth. That's all that you need to know. So for me, I much prefer this episode because I definitely think the depth and scope is there. And I see Mulder becoming a little bit more wild and out there and prepared to risk everything ultimately for the truth. And that's why he's the most interesting character in terms of, the chaos that he creates that Scully almost has to manage.
Regarding the connection between Deep Throat and Mulder, I found it really interesting to read that apparently Jerry Hardin, who played Deep Throat, and Chris Carter were considering making Deep Throat Mulder's father.
Oh, interesting. I love Deep Throat's introduction to the X-Files so early in the series. I feel that his involvement with Mulder and Scully gives them a kind of legitimacy. Like, they're not just kids anymore. Like in episode 1, like now their work is influential and serious. And I love his character, and I love the way the actor plays him as kindly, but also lethal. Sure, he's kindly, unless you step on his toes in some way, and then you're just a goner. At least that's the impression I got.
Yeah, I like. I mean, if we're only limiting the 2 episodes, right? Definitely episode 2 versus episode 1, because of the relationship and the characters, the gravitas that they were given, or that came out in the 2nd episode. And of course, all the things we've already talked about, right, are really important aspects of the episode for me. Reestablishing the X-Files for a longer run. And of course, Deep Throat had the function of I mean, while we talked about framing a second ago, right, about episode 1 like this, episode 2, so expansive. I think the introduction of Deep Throat hinted at something that wasn't just wide, but deep and significant. It was about perceptual reality, right? a person who lives in a box perceives his reality as being in the box, even though there's things outside the box. It's that Wizard of Oz pull back the curtain kind of moment, right? You see the powerful entity in front of you projected, and you know that it's destructive and it's got all kinds of greatness and grandeur. But as soon as you look behind the curtain, your perception of reality changes. And that's, I think, what Deep Throat was about. Deep Throat was helping from a structural standpoint. It's about helping to deepen that framing so that there's even more possibilities for future episodes. But in terms of society, the framing or the use of Deep Throat helps the audience understand that they're going to be given information that seems to be kind of behind the curtain, right? And that's part of the narrative that they're trying to establish in the show.
Well, and the X-Files came along when we already knew of, like Agent Bennett said, the greatest hits of the UFOs. We knew about Roswell already. We knew that the government had done LSD experiments on people that were unwitting to these experiments. We knew that that people knew that they weren't crazy for believing that conspiracies exist, because a number of them had been revealed to be actually factual. So the X-Files came along at just that time when we didn't trust our government at all, and we continue not to, I guess. But in the 90s, it was like you didn't really see that on TV, though, did you? Until the 90s.
I was just thinking about how like Deep Throat was specifically like based on character from All the President's Men. That's about the Watergate scandal.
Watergate, yeah.
Yeah.
To me, I thought like I felt like the stakes, especially as they sort of applied to Mulder and Scully, felt higher in the second episode. Like when they're forced off the road, and then everything that happens to Mulder, basically. I don't think there's as much that happens to them in the pilot.
Yeah, I mean, they lose their evidence, don't they, in a fire and things like that, but there's no direct threat to their life immediately, whereas this one, it absolutely is. So the stakes are raised. And I think that connection to Watergate is so important because it was talking about, corruption at the highest level, wasn't it? And, if you think about all the way through to today, we've got WikiLeaks, we've got Julian Assange, you've got people whose lives are at risk for exposing the truth. And that's something that, this show set up, that you've got to be able to risk everything, right? And in a world where we're not only postmodern, but I would argue post-futurist and post-truth in a way, I think the search for the truth has to be greater than ever, right? And what are people, what are individuals, what are societies, what are communities prepared to risk to expose governments and to expose the truth and pursue that, which is why this show continues to endure. But I think it's such an interesting one that Deep Throat risks his life and ultimately, as we know at the end of this first season, gives up his life for that pursuit so that the person pursuing the truth in the next generation, Mulder, can continue. And I really like in this episode that he doesn't seek out Mulder and Scully, Deep Throat, does he? He corners Mulder in a bathroom of a fairly grotty bar. So it's almost like, okay, I'm just going to talk to you about this because, we don't really know if we can trust Scully yet. Almost there's this like kind of, he's got somebody on his side, hasn't he, to help him push forward and to give him, that sense. And, it's going forward to the end of the season, isn't it? But, his final dying words are not to Mulder, they're to Scully. And ultimately, because he sacrificed his life to free Mulder, but he says to Scully, trust no one. So, it goes from this very Mulder-focused kind of father figure, which I can totally see why, potentially he could have been the father, into actually supporting both of them and realizing that they both need to work on this together, and that you need the skeptic alongside the far too willing to believe Mulder in order to get to the whole truth and not just a version of truth that you want to believe.
Wouldn't it? Do you think that if they had created the character as or framed or established the Deep Throat as the father, it would have it would have brought the framing of that show too narrow, right? It would have made it much more intimate, right? Because it was about dad communicating to son, and then son getting revenge for the whole story would have meandered in this very familial kind of war against the villains who killed dad.
Well,
So
and it also
sorry, go ahead, please.
no, it also would have. We also never would have had that wonderful later storyline of the cigarette smoking man having an almost fatherly attitude toward Mulder at the same time that he was trying to kill him at times. He also there was also some ambiguity, like, could he have been Mulder's father all along? Darth Vader, you're my dad? Oh God. Like, so yeah, I think you're exactly right. That would have just narrowed the vision, and instead we have all these father figures for Mulder. Some of them well-meaning, others not so much, which makes it a lot better and more interesting and richer.
I found a quote by Chris Carter I thought was interesting as well, where he it seemed like the way that he planned Deep Throat character, it was like specifically as like a character to be in opposition to the cigarette smoking man. Was how he referred to it.
Oh,
In the
that's
initial
interesting.
phases, yeah.
So they're both sort of deep within the system, aren't they? But one's fighting for good and one's not. And ultimately, there is that, isn't there? It's easy, I think, to sometimes look at government structures or look at kind of this idea of, deep governments and believe that everyone in there is just pure evil and they're all out for their own selfish things. But good people go and work within those systems to create a better world. And people like Deep Throat show that. And I think although there is this idea of, government's not to be trusted, actually, Mulder and Scully are both government employees. They're FBI. They're there with good intentions and good purpose. And you get amazing characters that show that the whole way through, which, are there for important reasons, I think, because, I think within the conspiracy sort of sphere world or paranormal investigation kind of circles, it can just become this deep-seated them and us. And that's division that's unhelpful and unhealthy. You should be skeptical about everyone and everything, but also be willing to believe in everyone and everything as well. And that's important.
It's amazing how as we're talking about, how the story's kind of constructed and the relationship between the characters, and that Mulder is spending all of his journey in the show trying to look past the curtain that has been constructed or put up, right, to keep most people away from the truth of what's perceptual, what the reality of what is the reality, not just the perceived reality of the masses, but the hidden reality. And all the characters in the know in the first season or beyond, maybe the second, third season, are older, right? And they have more experience. So structurally, I wonder if that kind of matches kind of the overall. Young want to know all this information. They suspect things going on, but they don't have access. They don't have wisdom. They don't have experiences to know, right, really what's outside that box. They just know the walls of the box, and they're just railing against having walls there and getting access to the stuff beyond. But the older people know, and they're saying, trust me, you may want the security of those walls and don't really want to know what's beyond that. So structurally, I found that really interesting because it parallels what goes on in life, in the real world, right? But I was thinking about the way the factions seems to exist in government or in the show, as how it portrayed, good guy versus bad guy, and there are these people, mechanizations that are going on behind the scenes. How similar it is to cliques in high school, right? That never really ends. You pick your side and you work to undermine the other guy to make sure your candidate gets picked as homecoming king or homecoming queen, or whatever the goal, the outcome is. It's so interesting how for me as an elementary school teacher, I saw all of these early stages of clique and friendships and that whole dynamic, and it didn't really change as they got older. It's still the same kind of group identity that kind of governs how the bigger social structures kind of play out, and that of course translates into governance as well.
Yeah,
So it's interesting parallels.
it's really funny how like Mulder and Scully are presented as very like lovable, attractive characters, both physically and intellectually. Like they're just attractive people, and it only now occurred to me after Agent Bennett said so that they are the man. Like they work for the government. Guess who pays them? The government. But all these decades of being an X-Files fan, it never occurred to me that they're the bad guy in a sense. I mean, only because they're not pure rebels, are they? They are.
No.
They do what they need to do in order to get what they want, as Agent Brad said.
And they are on the
realize
paycheck. Yeah.
One of the things that I've kind of considered, like watching other episodes and this one as well, when they're sitting in the bar and they're talking about they're going to go to Idaho, we're going to the Spud State, Ellen's Air Force Base. At a point, I'm thinking to myself, who assigned them this case? Like, in the real world, you would get an assignment from a supervisor. Most people, and I know they alluded to that in the first episode, that, Mulder's profiling of, I think it was Monty Props, has given him kind of free reign to work on whatever he wants to. When you think about like all the stuff that happens, the plane tickets, the motels, cost of this, that, and the other, like, how does this happen? Like, who assigned this job?
And also, like, similarly, like, it occurred to me, because I think, like, Deep Throat, one of Deep Throat's lines is, like, don't take this case or whatever. And I was like, isn't that, like, more of the purview of the, their supervisors or anything, rather than some guy in a bar?
Right.
Well, it's also interesting, as we learn in later episodes, that, and it was hinted at in episode 2, that what Mulder and Scully do is a component of what a department or a group need them to do, want them to do. So they're being manipulated, even in their protest, which, by the way, also is kind of what happens in the real world.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. That you're fed part of it, aren't you? And it's like, this is what you're doing, and this is why you think you're doing it, but actually you're doing it for this greater kind of purpose.
Or it gets co-opted, right? As you were saying earlier in the conversation beforehand, Agent Bennett, about one group has laudable goals, but because they align with another group and another group and another group, and they all want to marshal to get a larger movement, and suddenly your great message and your powerful message of equity and love and care for each other gets co-opted and gets overridden by somebody with a more violent or a more aggressive position. So it's the same factionalized kind of approach to, say, social politics or social justice or whatever that we see today are playing out in I would argue that, now that I have a lot of experience with television media, that a lot of those dynamics are presented in the stories that we're seeing, because those stories are meant to emulate real life, but they're more it's in the X-Files in particular, they're meant to distract us from the plights that we have in our own daily grind, so to speak.
I think there's one element of Scully actually that we haven't picked up on in this, just to link into this
just
bigger idea of
going to discuss characters, but yeah.
Oh, perfect. Oh, okay. It's the first, obviously it's only, we've had the pilot and then this one, but she's very prominently wearing her gold cross in this one. And it's never spoken of in this episode, obviously, but it's really interesting that while she's spouting these sort of government propaganda agenda type lines, she's there with this crucifix around her neck, you know, and it's like, so belief is a core part of her identity, as is his. And those beliefs obviously come into conflict and contrast later on. And there's wonderful episodes where that's explored in a lot of detail. But I think it is interesting that, you know, there are shots of there where it is very prominent, and it's just left there for people to notice and absorb without any kind of, you know, oh, what are you doing with that? Or, you know, there's no reference to her sort of going to church or anything at this stage, but it's just shown to us, isn't it? Which I think is significant.
Beautifully subtle, because it tells you so much, and it helps establish the character beyond the two dimensions that we initially see.
I was just thinking how, like, from like a Christian perspective, perhaps like Scully perhaps might see Mulder as like the types of folks that would be like interested in finding like the Shroud of Turin, or, you know, like some artifact to base like their belief on, in a way. So the question I was going to ask was, which of the minor characters do you like most in this episode?
Well, I've
Like,
got one.
other than Mulder and Scully.
So Mrs. McLennan, the wife of the test pilot, not the test pilot that the episode focused on, but the other one, the secondary one. And she was clearly very loyal to the Pentagon and to being the supportive role of the perfect wife and citizen. She was very much a company man, and I just thought she was delightful because she was clearly like, she was such a villain, you know. And, you know, I imagine a teenager watching the X-Files probably seeing her as a stand-in for their own mom, as they watch in their basement and listen to Rage Against the Machine, and they're like, F you, I won't do what you tell me, Mom.
Right.
And Mrs. McLennan and government, you know. It's like she was just so like cartoonishly evil. She was like, oh, you know, don't speak the truth, you know. As opposed to the other wife who was like, no, I must know, until she was silenced.
To kind of go off of what Agent Lisa is saying, one of the things I thought was interesting with the minor character of Mrs. McLennan's husband, not necessarily the character, just the creativity in creating kind of what he became, the plucking of the hair and using it on those little flies. I'm always in awe of people that can do art, whether it's music, visual arts, whatever, because I'm not an artistic person, but it's like, who the hell thought of that? It's weird, but damn, it's good. You know, it's just creepy enough that it's like, okay, nice. But it's not like over the top creepy.
Right.
I guess it could be. I mean, if it was my husband, you know, pulling his hair out, I'd be like, all right, we got to get this taken care of. But for TV, you know, you're like, all right, interesting. I thought one of the little roles that they had in here, Paul, who was also actually working for the government, I thought the acting was done really, really well when, you know, he came out just pretending to kind of be a news reporter locally, and just very cordial and very believable. And then, you know, like a switch, completely different when she figured it out, you know, when he walked out of that hotel or the motel room, and she's like, all right, something's up here. And, you know, he was a completely different character. Good acting on his part. It was interesting to see somebody in such a short span do so much, in my opinion. And it was good. It was good. Added you know, an element of mystery. And I'll be honest with you, the first time I watched that episode, I didn't realize that the reporter was the same guy. Is it Redbird? Something like that, whatever his code name was. I did not catch that the first time. So when I rewatched it, I was like, oh, okay. Just his ability to play just somebody so like nice and easygoing and seems very warm than, you know, that cold, calculating agent, military man, whatever he was. I thought that was really well done.
And you could say the same thing about Gillian Anderson in that scene where she first approaches him. She's touching her hair, she's smiling, she's acting a little scatterbrained. Oh my, where did I leave my socks? You know, and then in an instant flips to this like cold hard machine that like just gets things done and then kidnaps him at gunpoint. So you're right, like he did a great job acting, and I think she deserves credit for her acting in this episode as well.
Absolutely. You know what you just said, she came out and yeah, she was probably a little bit flustered with what was going on, couldn't make the phone call. Mulder went MIA, there's all this stuff going on. And it's like, she immediately knew something was up as soon as he walked out of that room. And she played it cool. She took a couple of seconds to figure out how she was going to play it and didn't want to tip Paul off. And, like you said, just kind of touching her hair and smiling, and then bam, did what she needed to do to protect herself. Stole a car, held him at gunpoint, eventually got her partner back. It's like, all right, go.
I almost think that was a bit of a nod to the first portrayal of Scully in episode 1. That kind of flirty, kind of maybe it was even a commentary about how women may have perceived how women may have had to act in during their time in the office or in the career, right? They would have had to be, a little overly feminine, or maybe that was what the expectation was at the time, right? That in order for you to get ahead at the office, you need to be, a flirtatious person. But I think what in the episode 2, it shows that she's capable of that, which is what possibly is what men perceive as the usual, the usual behavior for a woman, but she uses it to get through to the end goal, which is to find out what the hell's happened with Mulder.
And
right?
she's going to use it again in other episodes and in other seasons, and it's well played.
Exactly. So I think I would hope that was planned by the director to create that duality within the character, so you could see it wasn't just the hard-nosed, it wasn't just the flirtatious, it was, this is who she is as a character, and there's the cross and all these little subtle things that help establish this person this character as a person in herself. And she doesn't necessarily follow all the rules in the professional expectations, and she doesn't also follow the normal societal rules that everyone else. She's a unique person, and that's a beautiful opportunity for the character to have, or even for the actress to portray, because there's so much room for her in that character to play with, so many layers. I would hope that it was planned. I would hope that the show producers said, we need to give this character life. And
well, I think so. And just like what I was saying earlier about that minor character arc within one episode, where she was given license to grow and change her mind, where she started off as being like, I forgot the quote, but you quoted it perfectly, Agent Bennett, where she essentially said, a government has a right to keep some things confidential. So she's like, she follows the rules, but then she completely broke them, and she changed her mind, and she's like, oh, the government, and then she's like, the government, like she completely, and that's all in one episode she was allowed to change, which shows how dynamic they knew what they were doing, I believe, because of that, because they allowed her to be so just the fact that they allowed her to not be one note, the fact that they allowed her character to be so rich. And like you were saying, Agent Brad, that on the one hand, she's, kind of being a little manipulative and extra friendly. And on the other hand is a stone cold, killer, not killer, but she gets the job done. Yeah, all of those things show to me that they, right from the beginning, knew what they were doing. At least Chris Carter did.
And it's interesting to me that and I know we're talking about secondary characters, and I'll make my point about secondary characters in a second, but It's interesting that they establish Scully first.
Mhm.
right? The depth of Mulder's character doesn't get established until later. He's much more monodimensional, right, in terms of what he is, what he stands for in the show. She has greater depth initially, but the character that I enjoyed, because again, like Agent Michaels was saying, the reporter, right, he played it really well, acted well. I liked the woman in the diner.
Oh yeah.
Small role, right? Good actors do what is expected of them, and they inhabit the character. And they don't try to tell too much subtext. They just let it be, and that's what she did. She played, hey, I'm just here to talk about this, and I'm a little bit, conspiracy kind of person. Look at these pictures. I'll sell it to you for $20.
Sucker.
She covered the range of that character just well, and it helped to anchor, as we were talked about earlier, it helped anchor that new dynamic between the two buddies, right? Sucker, that kind of thing was an important scene for the relationship between the two characters. So I liked her. I liked that
Cool.
that diner waitress.
I think my favorite, like, sort of minor characters were like the Budahas children. 'Cause there's like one, I kept thinking, like, it must be such a cool, like, opportunity for kids to have to appear in the show, especially in, like, the second episode. And actually, I don't think they're named, like, the actor, the children actors.
Like credited at the end, you mean?
Yeah. But also, like, there's one scene that I really like where it's like Mulder and Scully are talking with Anita Budahas, and the children are with her, and the girl, like, keeps, like, absolutely staring at her mom, and I'm like, you do know Mulder and Scully are in the scene too, but she never looks at them. So yeah, I thought it was quite funny. Like, do you have a favorite location in this episode?
I mean,
like-
internal. Sorry, go on.
No, I just liked the outside, when they're outside, on the hill, seeing the stars and the skies, and for that reason, that I liked the innocence of Mulder's reaction when he came to get Scully from the car. I just like that shot of being out there and the wide world, kind of paralleling the framing of the arc of the stories that we're going to be seeing. It's so expansive, and it's the night sky, it's the stars, it's space, it's aliens and strange objects, and I like that moment.
I like
I
that one
do-
too. And I think it also, shows the differences between Mulder and Scully, that they're looking at the same thing, but it's again two very different perspectives and justifications of what's happening there. And it just ties into everything, and it's just a very classic Mulder and Scully scene. Just a random piece of information with that. Chris Carter chalks that laser light show up as to some of the worst effects he has ever done. He said, budgetary restraints, they couldn't do too much, but he said those are the worst effects he ever did on this series. But it's the second episode. What are you working with? Probably not a lot, but Mulder and Scully made it believable, and the reactions were genuine, and it was true to who each of them is or was as a character, and it just solidified the bond and kind of the battle between the two of them. And it just it's just the beginning.
Definitely. I think my favorite location is, so he breaks in through the fence and he goes for that really long walk / run, presumably all the way to the base. And
Which apparently took ages to film.
I really, I think it's beautiful because they've kind of broken into that before, obviously, with Emil and Zoe, and then they're sort of at the fence shouting through this wire fence, only go as far as the long grass, and then there's that lovely line about, did we tell him about the landmines and junk, which is brilliant. And then the next thing you see, obviously, he's got to the end of the long grass and it's still sort of daylight, and he's got a choice. He could run out there in that moment, or he can sit and wait. And despite him being super passionate and super needing to get in there, he has got that capacity to sit and wait for the darkness to fall. And there's a lovely shot of him where it goes from light to dark, and then you just see his face kind of lit up with the excitement of it all. And then he's on the runway, and then you've got that beautiful shot where they clearly spent the money on the special effects for that episode, where you actually have the really cool triangular UFO hovering. And it goes from that obviously to the silent arrival of all the, sirens and stuff after that. So for me, that's just a lovely sequence and beautiful in terms of art and cinematography.
I do have a question. I do have a comment about that. I agree that the only thing in the episode that really struck me as kind of bad direction, or it's where they, the transition from what the story needs to have happen and from a visual perspective about how they get there. I think it was really, he walks out of the tall grass and he's basically on the tarmac, right? He's on the runway. Why is he choosing to run from the oncoming?
And why wouldn't you head back into the grass?
The tarmac. Why did he go? I'm looking at it and I'm saying to myself, idiot! What? Stay on the only terrain that the trucks can actually drive on. So that's the a real obvious flaw in the episode. It doesn't make sense to me. But that's just an aside. Sorry.
No, I agree. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I don't know. To me, you guys are talking shit about my boyfriend Mulder, and he doesn't ever do anything wrong. So he chose to run, and he was right.
He was obviously awestruck by the UFOs and just thought, I'm just going to run in the glory of what I have seen.
Maybe.
Or maybe he wanted to get caught, right, so he could get inside.
There's a good point.
I know it down like 4 different locations I thought really stood out. I thought it was really cool that you see Mulder's apartment for the first time.
He was cooking.
I thought sort of quirky locations were like the Flying Saucer Diner and the racetrack at the end. I was like, why choose those as locations? I thought makes an interesting choice. And then finally, the Buddha house, which was later used in the pilot of Millennium as Frank Black's house.
Oh.
I think the running track's a really interesting symbolic location, isn't it? Because it is going to be this race, this ongoing pursuit of excellence, this ongoing pursuit of the win, ultimately. And to be out there on the track and see him sweating and sweating and sweating, he's so desperate for it. And he's, it's that idea of, how many times you're going to have to go around that track, because you're going to go in circles for a long time, right, before you break free and actually get told, here's what you're looking for. So it's that endless pursuit of knowledge and truth, I think, symbolized in that setting, which is great for the end of that episode.
And it's beautiful metaphor, right? But the idea that it's endless also makes it seem futile.
Exactly.
Yeah, like he's chasing his own tail. It does seem futile. I missed that symbolism. Thanks for pointing it out. Now I think it's really beautiful.
He's also the only one running, right? So who's he racing against? He's in a race against himself, ultimately, isn't he? And he could just wear himself out completely.
So how many X's out of 10 would you give this episode?
How many what?
How many X's out of 10 would you give this episode?
A ranking, okay.
Yeah.
9. I thought it was so interesting and exciting, and it had the car chase thrill of things, but it also had moments of real emotional depth, and it was funny as hell. So I think it hit all the pleasure points for me. So 9.
Cool.
I'm gonna give it an 8.5. I felt like this episode. Sorry. I felt like, especially when you're comparing the pilot to this episode, the previous episode seems much more fragmented in so many ways. This episode, everything did seem much more cohesive. Everything made more sense. The interaction between characters was just good. The banter seemed natural. It didn't seem forced. Nothing was campy. I think there were a couple of times during that pilot episode, it's like they're still trying to figure out what they're going to do, where they're taking this. So there were some things that just did seem a little campy and kind of overdone. I didn't really feel any of that this episode. I definitely felt like this was something that they put together purposely, and starting with that mythology storyline, and they needed to come out the gate strong with that to introduce that, and they did a good job with it. There were a couple of things that weren't great, but I mean, you're not going to have every episode be perfect, and that's what makes it interesting.
Well, I remember last week I went really high. I went 8.5 on the pilot, and I think this is better. So I've got to go 9, right? So, and I think it's better because it's slicker, but also because, like we've said, it's more expansive. It's dealing with kind of more highbrow in terms of the content, I would guess. But it's still got those lovely flecks of humor through it. But I kind of like some of the quirkiness and silliness of the pilot. And I think there's definitely less comedy in this one. So I'm going to go with a 9. Because I think overall it's slicker and it's better, but yeah, it lacks a little bit of the heart or the slight kind of comedy, I would say, of the first one.
I am not as generous in my scoring on this episode as the rest of you. I would have given the pilot episode a 4. I liked it for its theme. I didn't necessarily like the way the characters are portrayed, and it doesn't surprise me that it took a year between the pilot and the rest of it. It's almost like a second pilot, right? So I give this one a 7 because I think I think there were good things about it. I still think the relationship, even though it's beginning, still seems a little awkward at times. Some of the dialogue was a little bit wonky. Some of the choices, Scully gets off the phone in the, at the motel they're staying at, and she runs across the parking lot to go tell Mulder something about, releasing of the guy who's come home. These things just seemed a little bit awkward for me, for characters. I know it was about setting up a sense of urgency, maybe in the scene, but it just seemed to not fit with the characters. So I would give it a 7 because I think it's better than the pilot, but still a lot more room for improvements, as we see in episode 3, 4, 5, 6, and the rest of this first season. It just keeps getting stronger, I think. But yeah, I give it a 7.
Cool. I wrote down an 8 because I agree that I think it's stronger than the pilot as well. There's quite a few scenes I really like in different locations, and we'll be speaking with the assistant location manager who worked on the first 5 seasons of the X-Files next week. I worked on Deep Throat as the first episode of this series, so we look forward to that season, that show. You feel free to write comments in the comment section, like and subscribe to the video, and thanks to the panelists for joining. The truth is out there.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.